This is October 11th, 2019, and I am interviewing Susan Brownmiller. And the first question is, what was your life like before you got involved in the women's movement?
Yeah, boy. I think I never understood why I couldn't get a better job wherever I was. We were aware of this discrimination, but we didn't have that word sexist yet, so it was all very confusing to me. Yeah.
And you grew up where?
I grew up in Brooklyn. I was born in 1935, and my parents were lower middle class. And I say lower because except for the war years where people did well, my father had trouble earning a living. He just did have trouble. And he ended up in the garment center as a salesman, which he was really wrong for. But it was the work that he found. He grew up in a shtetl in Poland called, the Poles called it Augustowa, but the Jews called it Jagostev, that in Yiddish, Jagostev, that's where he was from. And he had a terrible accent. He was not good at English. But he worried a lot about his ability. He was just obsessed with, how do you support a daughter? He went overboard, and he campaigned to have me take a commercial class in high school. Now that was crazy. I was very bright, and I wanted to go to college, and my mother wanted me to go to college. In fact, she taught me to say this little phrase when I was a kid. When I grow up, I'm going to go to Smith, Vassar, or Wellesley, and then to curtsy. And he's trying to tell me to take the commercial class course in high school. So, it was a very divided family. But, I forgive them because I turned out pretty interesting anyway. That's what I tell everybody who complains about their parents. But look at you. You survived and you're doing just fine. So,
and you ended up in Cornell.
I ended up in Cornell well, yes, but my mother didn't have enough money. My mother was paying, helping to pay for it. And she didn't have enough money. She didn't want to tell me that, but she thought I'd be happy with a year at Cornell. So then I went back a second year, and I was a waitress, in the dormitories, and I was a terrible waitress in the dining hall. They had this thing called gracious living. Gracious living. It wasn't gracious for us, the waitresses. So I did that. Anyway, I did not graduate from Cornell.
But then what happened after you got out of...
I was finding my way toward journalism. I got very lucky. In 1965, I had gone into the civil rights movement, and I had been sent to for the Freedom Summer. That's what it's called now, the Summer Project. And I was assigned to Meridian, and Meridian was where Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were killed. Outside of Meridian in Philadelphia. And then I came back to New York to, it seemed important to vote for Lyndon Johnson, But then I went back I was working at Newsweek and as a so-called researcher, a fact checker, that's what I was. And I decided I just couldn't take this life, and I went back to Mississippi. And I was assigned to the central office of COFO, Congress of Federated Organizations, in Jackson on Lynch Street. And the movement was in terrible shape. They, it was just awful. There was very little spirit left. And the press was not interested much anymore in the civil rights movement in Mississippi after Goodman, Shorter, and Cheney were killed. That kind of ended that. But I had heard that there was something called the cotton election in the Delta where blacks could vote. It wasn't like going to the courthouse and registering to vote. You could vote in the cotton election in your town. So a guy and I went to a town and wrote something. I couldn't get the press, official press, to write anything, but I had a friend at the Village Voice, Jack Newfield, and this is 65, and I said, Jack, I don't know what to do, but here's a piece I wrote on this cotton election. So he gave it to Dan Wolfe, the editor-in-chief, and the editor-in-chief said, that's very interesting, and he ran it. And it got a lot of mail, you know, and the mail section of the Village Voice was very popular because it was free. You know, people wrote their letters, they agreed, they disagreed, and Dan was pretty pleased with the result of my article on the cotton election. And he said to Jack, well, do you think she might like to contribute to us at The Voice? I mean, that was a miracle for me. I mean, did I know it was a miracle? Not particularly. I wasn't really a Village Voice reader at that time. But I started freelancing for the Village Voice. And I had lots of friends who gave me tips to under-the-radar stories, you know, because I didn't want something that would be in the New York Times, you know, so I was scrambling for stuff that nobody else was covering. And it worked very well. It really worked very well for me.
So how did you get involved in the women's movement?
Well, there was an early group, very early group in New York called New York Radical Women. It was the first group in New York. And they would say at every meeting, we're not feminists, you know. They were red diaper babies for the most part. But they wanted to meet by themselves, ourselves, and talk about stuff that the men were not letting us talk about. Apparently, I don't know. But my friend Jan Goodman said, you know, there's this group that's meeting, and why don't you come? They're really talking about women. And I said, oh yeah, sure, they're talking about women. So I went to a meeting, and just my luck, Kathy and Matnick, then Kathy Sarachild, was a big deal in this group. And she said, okay, tonight's meeting is when you want to have a child, do you want to have a boy or a girl? That's pretty simple, you know. And Peggy Dobbins said, come on, Kathy, we've been over this before. And I told you that I had a child, a beautiful boy, and I had to give him away. And boy, did the ice break. And one by one, people started to talk about, basically about how they found an abortion doctor. Some went to New Jersey, went to a mafia place, had to be blindfolded. I mean, the stories were amazing. And they were all about one abortion, and it was coming around to me. And, you know, I'm competitive. So I said, well, I've had 3 illegal abortions out of the continental United States. And, you know, to say that out loud. And then I sort of started to cry. And I said, I guess I'm lucky to be alive today, you know, because you put yourself in such great risk trying to find an abortion doctor who's for real, who's a good provider. And there was Jan Goodman, and I said, Jan, and my last one was 6 months ago, and I didn't even tell you, did I? It was just amazing to me. So,
So this was
So
it a
this-
consciousness raising group?
well,
or-
yes, it was consciousness raising, but it was definitely anti-feminist, because as red diaper babies, they had this view, and of course this view was also held by liberals, that they felt that feminism was bad. It was eugenics or something like that. They had absorbed that. As for rape, as I discovered later, rape is a white woman falsely accusing a black man and then he gets lynched. You know, that was their theory. In fact, a couple of years later, I mean, New York Radical Feminists was then, they're the people who did the Miss America protest. And Carol Hainish, whom I knew, hadn't invited me to the meetings because, this is funny, she thought that I was so successful as a writer that I wouldn't get what women's oppression was. Ha ha ha.
So she invited you to the meetings?
No, she didn't invite me. My friend Jan Goodman invited me. No, Carol knew who I was and didn't invite me. And then a few years later, Kathy Amatnik said to me, after I published Against Our Will, she said, well, I haven't read your book, Susan. It's not that I wouldn't read it, but there's so many issues to deal with, and rape isn't an issue. Yep.
Oh my God.
And she said it in front of Joan Lester, who was married to Julius Lester, who was black. And I mean, Joan Lester's face just went, and my face went, But that was their leftist background. You know?
Well, how did you get from New York Radical Feminist, right, which was the red diaper group?
New York Radical Feminist
New York Radical
was Shuli Firestone and Ann Kurt.
Okay. So
Yes.
how did you get from New York Radical Women to New York Radical
It
Feminists?
eventually broke apart.
Okay.
It had a lot of people coming. We would meet, I think, on University Place once a week, but you couldn't go, all the time once a week. I saw Kathy Boudin there. I knew it was Kathy Boudin. This was before, she became a Weather Underground person, but before the townhouse
bombing,
exploded,
right?
the bombing,
Mhm.
yeah.
Well, how did you get from that group to New York Radical Feminists?
Well,
And who started New York Radical Feminists anyway?
well, New York Radical Feminist was basically Ann Kurt and Shuli Firestone.
Okay.
And they wanted to keep the leftists out. See, the leftists were always our problem. Yes, we're the strong women. So they were nervous. So they set up their group called the Stanton Anthony Brigade. Jane Kramer wrote about it for The New Yorker. It was called the Founding Cadre. But for some reason, I don't know if the women were afraid to use their real names or Jane Kramer decided that she would make up names and change their identities. Short women became tall women, blondes became brunettes. I mean, she messed up everything in that article, and it was published in The New Yorker. But their feeling was that we had to be nervous about these leftists, and we're the Stanton Anthony Brigade, and they are going to, we're going to form all these groups on a neighborhood basis, which was brilliant.
So you were in the original brigade.
No, the original one was Stanton Anthony.
Okay.
We were in something we named, because it was on a neighborhood basis, we were in West Village 1. We had a group that lived in Greenwich Village. So that's who we were. But their idea was that we were supposed to study for 6 months and then apply to membership. It was so elitist. I mean, it's unbelievable. We had monthly meetings at the General Theological Seminary in Chelsea, this beautiful space.
And by that time, there were lots of different groups, right? I mean, there was the Village One, and I was on the Upper West Side. And there were about 3 groups on the Upper West Side.
Yeah.
And then, once a month on Sundays, we would go to the
To the
union.
meeting at
Right.
the General Theological Seminary.
Right, and I was at one of the meetings where they discussed having a rape conference or speak
Well,
out
I'm
first.
pleased.
Yeah.
We have our memories of that. So at one of these meetings, one of the leftists came in. And she said, "What do you people do besides contemplating your navels? What are your actions?" And in truth, there weren't any actions. We were very involved with consciousness raising. So, and Kurt said, Susan, because I had begged to get on the agenda for the Ladies' Home Journal sit-in, which was started in a group called Media Women. That was another group altogether. So when the leftists said, "What do you people do? What are your actions?" And Kurt had to say something, and she said, "Susan, would you like to talk about this upcoming magazine action you're having?" Yeah, so that's how we got the news to New York Radical Feminists.
So was it your idea or
There
a
were
collective
five or
idea?
six. I was not only my idea.
Right.
Of course not. If it was just my idea, it would go nowhere. No, this group called Media Women was made up of media women. And at a meeting there, I'm pretty sure I said something like, "You know what, I think we should have some," because this was like 68 and Columbia, they had occupied all the buildings. I mean, that theory that you could do something so impudent was very much in the culture.
Yep.
So I said, "I think we should have some sort of action at a women's magazine." And I said, like we should build it around Good Housekeeping doesn't have my seal of approval. That was their sign. Good Housekeeping, seal of approval. So I said that. But then this woman named Sandy North said, "Let's do it at the Ladies' Home Journal. I used to work there. I have contacts that are still there." They're all go, "Yay!" And that's how it happened. We chose the Ladies' Home Journal.
And you sat in their office, right?
And we sure did.
And-
And we sure got a lot of people to come, about 200 women. I mean, I was amazed that many people showed up. We had Barnard Women's Liberation, Columbia Women's Liberation, New York Radical Feminists, even Red Stockings. There was a Red Stockings then, Yes, people came. A lot of people came. And it was a remarkable, our sit-in lasted 11 hours.
Wow. And you were in the office of the
John Mack Carter.
Jane Marquardt.
Yes. Now, there's a guy, he didn't think that, it was a great success in life to be the editor of a women's magazine, but that was the card that life dealt him. But it never occurred to him that there were lots of women who didn't care for his magazine and what it represented. And a male editor and no blacks whatsoever, because that, of course, was one of our issues. So Sally Kempton was my pal then from the Village Voice. She did 20 pages of article suggestions. And I wrote the demands. We demand. I also called Marlene Sanders at ABC TV News, and she was very helpful because she walked in right after we got there, went right over to John Mack Carter and said, "What is your response to what these women are saying?" And he lost his voice. He couldn't believe this was happening. He later said that it was the most transformative day of his life. Yeah. Whew. But there were people at the demo who felt this wasn't radical enough. I mean, people have said,
The sit-in
maybe you
then.
had agent provocateurs from the, I said, no, they were not agent provocateurs deliberately. They were just difficult young women. And at one point, Shuli Firestone, well, first of all, she came over to me and she said, "Susan, am I your leader in New York Radical Feminists?" I said, yes, Julie, I guess you are. I had so much trouble getting them to go to the to the sit-in. I said, yes, I guess you are. She said, so you tell the press they have to talk to me. And I said, Julie, they're going to talk to whoever they want. Every woman here, you know, should be able to say something to them if they're asked. So that wasn't good enough for Julie. And she jumped on a chair. She had a copy of the Ladies' Home Journal, and she tried to tear it. Well, you know, it was a big, substantial magazine, and she couldn't really tear it. So then she threw it down, and she said, we can get him, he's small. And she leaped onto his desk. But before she hit he was just sitting there frozen. I was frozen. But Carla J was standing on the side, and Carla had taken some karate or judo classes. And I'll be damned. As Shuli was hurtling toward John McCarter, Carla managed to deflect her, and Shuli landed in the arms of some protesters, you know, a long time. It was amazing. It was just amazing that happened, because if she had grabbed John McCarter's desk, then they would have called the police, and it would have been all over. But it wasn't all over. Now, there's some people who believe that Shuli's action got John McCarter to start taking us seriously in terms of negotiations. I don't know if that's true or not, but he was very weary, and he said, all right, I want to negotiate with a small group of you. Everyone said, Carla, Carla! And the others go, stay, do what you want. You know, and then there were others who said, no, this isn't radical enough. They wanted to turn over the filing cabinets. I mean, they were, you know, they're unrealistic. And Jan Goodman, I had anointed Jan Goodman as our legal advisor. She was then going to law school. And she would go to them, she said, you know, if you do that, you're going to get arrested, and it'll probably be too late for us to get you out. You'll be spending overnight in jail. They said, what? Well, I have to go to school tomorrow. I can't be here. I mean, they were unrealistic. But anyway, it was a great success, and the Journal gave us $10,000 to produce a 6-page supplement in the Journal.
Which I read.
Yeah.
And got me involved in New York Radical Feminists.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah.
I read it. It was after the march, I think, or the big march on Fifth Avenue.
That was earlier, yeah.
And I wrote back to Now and New York Radical Feminist, and New York Radical Feminist was the only one who wrote back. Now, as usual, was totally inefficient, but that's a whole nother story. But how did you get from that action to the rape conference? Because you were one of the organizers,
well, okay.
And at the same time,
yes,
organizational.
Well, I was organizing, but I didn't. Well, I wanted to write. By that time, I really wanted to be a writer, and I had gotten a tryout at ABC TV News. It was the longest tryout in the history of ABC News, but they finally had to offer me a job.
But you were already a well-known writer for the Village Voice.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what happened when you were at ABC News? Or ABC?
Well, I was a well-known writer at the Village Voice for $75 a week.
Okay.
$75 a story. Yes, I had a category at the unemployment office called partially employed. And I couldn't live on it. And I said to Dan, I said, I need more money. And he said, well, I could put you on staff for $100 a week. And, you know, that wasn't really much of a salary, because at ABC, I was getting the Writers Guild minimum of $300 a week. And I said, I can't do it, Dan. And he said, well, it was one of the Michaels, Michael Smith, two Michaels. He said, Michael is leaving his 8th Street walk-up And I'll say to him that, he should give you first crack at it. I said, I'm getting too old for a walk up.
So how old were you then?
I was always older than most of them. Every time I'd meet Gloria Steinem, she'd say, just remember, I'm 6 months older than you.
You were working at ABC, right? And writing
I
for
had
the
to
Village
say goodbye to the Village Voice.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Well, I had to.
Yeah.
Because I was like in my 30s, and it was time to be a grown-up.
At that time, there were things happening. There was infighting at New York Radical Feminists, and yet this conference was on, and I don't remember Shirley being active in NERF.
Well, no,
at the time
because
the planning
she was
went
writing
on.
her book now.
Okay.
All the people in the Stanton Anthony Brigade had book deals. They had one black person, Celestine Ware. She got a book contract. They wanted Ann Kurt to write a book. I mean,
And Shirley had a book contract.
Shirley had a book contract, yes. Ellen Willis gave it to her because they had asked Ellen, but Ellen said she wasn't ready to write a book, and she recommended Shirley, and they said, okay.
And Ellen was in the Stanton Brigade, too?
No, she was in Red Stockings.
She was in Red Stockings,
there,
okay.
But they knew
she's
each other.
Okay.
Yeah, she had come to New York Radical Women meetings. Yeah. And she became an insider instantly, Ellen Willis. She was, she looked right,
Mm-hmm. With that red hair.
She'd sit on with her red hair, and she'd rock up and down and say things. And I got in trouble with her once because she said, she started talking about housewives, the problem of housewives. And she said, we're going to go into every household and we'll form a union of housewives. And me and my big mouth, I said, you know what, the shops are too small. And people were really upset that I'd made a wisecrack. And Judith Duffett, who was there in the room, came to me and said, you better watch it or you're not going to stay in this movement. Yeah, whoa. And then we had something called the Congress to Unite Women that I called the Congress to Divide Women. And Judith Duffett and some others started a petition to condemn me and Lucy Commissar for seeking to rise to fame on the back of the women's movement. Because at that time, there was this whole anti-elitist thing, And even in my own consciousness-raising group, what happened was that I went to the New York Public Library and then I wrote this history of rape, right? And it took several years. And I went, I was still going to my consciousness-raising group, and I went to them and said, well, I finished my book. And one member of my own group said to me, why don't you be the first feminist who doesn't put her name on a book? I mean, your ideas came from all of us. I thought, oh, this is not good for my health.
Well, we still have to get to how you...
Oh yes, how
you planned or was
the
part of the
Speak Out.
Planning group of the Speak Out and then the conference,
Right.
and who were the key people
Absolutely.
in that? Because you were one of the key people.
Yeah.
So
was Lelia Mullaney.
So was Lelia Mullaney. And wasn't the person who did something on incest? She lived in this.
Florence Rush.
Florence Rush. Was she on the planning committee, or was she a speaker and a presenter?
She became a speaker. Somebody knew her. Florence made this miraculous leap from the old left to the new politics. Florence was amazing. And somebody in the group suggested that she actually came to the Speak Out, but she was proposed as a person to come to speak at the conference. And she did.
And you spoke, and so did Phyllis Chesler.
Yes,
speak,
Phyllis made,
at the conference.
was wrong. Phyllis has said that she thought she was at the Speak Out.
No,
but she wasn't. At
right,
the
and
Speak Out.
I think I was part of that mistake. But I actually didn't go to Speak Out. I did not go to Speak Out. I went to the conference, and that's what I remember. And it was like a million explosions in my head at that conference. It was so great from beginning to end.
It was great.
So seminal.
But Florence was the star.
Mm-hmm.
It was not Phyllis Chesler.
Well, Phyllis Chesler was my star. I mean, I would put, because I had worked as a mental health worker and at a halfway house for ex-mental patients, and so
she did do that book.
And I had talked to a lot of women at the halfway house in Chicago who recounted how often they had been raped, and to even get that job, I had to have a test on syphilis. Anybody who worked in mental health in the state of Illinois had to be tested for syphilis because they assumed there would be this sexual relationship between the staff and the patients, and it was rampant rape and assault, and all the women were disbelieved, because they were mental patients. Yeah. So, but they were being raped.
Okay.
So, do we want to have a break?
Let's have a break.
Okay.
There was a woman in the Stanton Anthony Brigade named Diane Carruthers. And she was well aware that the other members in the brigade were no longer organizing the neighborhood groups. They all had book
contracts.
Yes. So she asked if she could join West Village One, and she did. And one evening, she came in with a paper from California. It Ain't Me, Babe. It was a women's alternate paper. I mean, these things were just happening. And she threw the paper down, and it was a transcript of a hitchhike rape. And she said, "This is our next issue, rape." And in my usual way, I'm always a little bit behind. There are always others who kind of had a vision before I did. I said, "You're saying rape is a political crime against women?" Because I had the liberal and left theory that rape was a white woman falsely accusing a black man, So Sarah Pines in our group, a very quiet person, said, "Well, I'll talk about my hitchhike rape," and she did. She was going from her college. She'd gone to one college. Was going back to her college over a weekend, and two guys in a car came over to her and said, "You're looking for a ride?" And she was a very trusting person. And she got in the car, and sure enough, they pulled to the side of the road and they raped her. And she called the police. They didn't harm her physically, deeply physically, with bruises. And she called the cops, and the cops said to her, "Now, who'd want to rape a nice girl like you?" That was the cops' response. So she learned something. So she told us this at a meeting of, New York Radical Feminist West Village One. And then Susan Franks also talked about how she had an experience in Paris with a friend, and they invited some guys to their room in the hotel, and so all of a sudden it was like a near rape situation, but they got the guys out. It was revelation to me, because I've done a lot of hitchhiking, but somehow I've known that you never get into a car with more than one man in it. I mean, I don't know how I knew these rules of the road, but I felt that, I guess, listening to Sarah Pines and Susan Frankel that they were much more trusting of men than I was. I don't know where. I just knew there were rules of the road, and you just got to be careful when you're out hitchhiking. So that was a revelation to me. So I said, all right, let's have a conference on rape. And then somebody else said, come on, Susan, we start with a speak out, and then we have a conference. I said, oh, right. Rosemary Gaffney said that. So I was always learning from the other people in my group. We had the speak out, and I took tickets at the door. That's what I did, and then I went in to listen.
Now, did Leah Mullaney do a lot for the speak out or the conference?
For the conference, she definitely did. She chaired the meetings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For the speak out,
who knows?
Who knows? Just collective action. Just
yes, people volunteered.
You just have to book the place, get the word out, and
they
get
did.
the speakers. Yeah,
and they did. It was astonishing. They all had different skills.
And a few hundred showed up, as I remember.
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
as I was told, because I wasn't there.
The speak out. Yes, and Alex. That's when Alex Schulman testified. They had all kinds of people. It ran the gamut of, as it turned out, of what sexual assault was all about,
and the particulars of it. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, and a lot of
yeah.
First you were raped, and then incredulous or prurient interest by the police. So it was like you had both.
Absolutely.
You had both experiences,
Yeah.
and the aftermath was as bad as the
one woman,
or almost as bad,
who testified at the speak out, said that this guy was trying to get her down an alley in a basement. He was trying to drag her, and she kicked him in the balls, and he gave up. So she told this story, and then she called the cops, who said, well, I think you did enough to that poor fellow. We're not going to go out looking for him. The testimony was amazing.
So after the speak out...
After the speak out, no, then Gail Sheehy, the reporter. I mean, our people knew how to get reporters. They were always trying to get Gloria Steinem, one of our people had gotten in touch with Gail Sheehy. She was at New York Magazine then. And she wrote a great piece on the speak out, a great piece. And that's when I began to think. I thought, am I just an organizer again, or am I a writer? Why, I was very nice that Gail Sheehy wrote this terrific piece for New York Magazine, but hey, I was one of many people who facilitated the speak out. So that got me thinking about a book. Eventually, I, because of my Village Voice contacts, I had gotten a lot of letters over the years from people saying, they all use the same language. If you have a book in you, please let me know. And I didn't have a book in me then, but I kept the letters. And I chose one agent and one editor. So I called the agent, and she said, yes, I think if you could deliver a book in 1 year, it'd be very timely. And then she said, and who are your editor contacts? And I said, well, it's Jonathan Dolcher at Simon & Schuster. She said, oh, he's a friend of mine. Let's take it to Jonathan. So it happened 1, 2, 3.
And this was before the conference?
It was just before the conference.
Okay.
Because what happened is that Minda Bickman and I were handing out flyers for the conference on 8th Street, near the 8th Street bookstore. And that's when a guy stealthily came up behind me and pinched me in the rear end. And then kept walking. But I was so angry. I followed him. And what did I know about self-defense? I had taken some modern dance classes. So I swung my foot at him, and then my foot came down, and I sprained my ankle. But I got him good in his rear end, and he kept walking. So I had to go to the hospital to take care of my ankle. And then I wrote a piece for the Village Voice called On Goosing, which was a joke title, because all the leftist famous articles were on this, on that, on the Jewish question, on that question, on the woman question. Yes, I called it On Goosing.
So you're planning
so then
the conference.
we got to the conference.
Mm-hmm.
And I was hobbling.
But there were several hundred people at the conference.
There
I
sure
remember.
were.
And it was a public school, I think.
Yeah.
On the Upper East Side.
Yeah.
It was packed, jam-packed with people.
Absolutely.
And the morning started with good presentations at plenary.
Yeah.
And then there were excellent workshops.
I wasn't the only one from New York Radical Feminists at that conference who thought, there must be a book in this, I wasn't the only one. One woman wrote a very poignant piece called Why I'm Not Writing a Book About Rape, and it was because she went to the New York Public Library and looked in the card catalogs, and there was no category for rape. I got to the New York Public Library, and I discovered they had this room there called the Writer's Room, and if you had a book contract, you could get in. But there were so many people, it took me a long time to get into the Allen Room. But it made all the difference in the world to me, because they let you keep your books for a month at your desk, and the librarians were just so helpful. Like I said to a librarian one day, I said, "Look, I'm looking for rape in World War I." And she said, "Oh, you look up www. World War I atrocities." So I did, and that's where all the testimony of women getting raped in World War I was. Now, who would have known that? Only a librarian. Yeah. And then I went to the Jewish division, and I said, "Is there any information on rape during the pogroms?" He said, "Absolutely." He gave me books about rape during the pogroms. I mean, I couldn't have done it without the New York Public Library, and I couldn't have done it without the new friends I made in that writer's room, because it was the first time that I was in the company of writers who were writing long books, which was very different from writing a short piece for the Village Voice, or doing book reviews for the New York Times, which I was doing a lot of by then. So it was all new to me.
And you weren't active in New York Radical Feminists at that time.
Well, I'd go to meetings, but there came a time when I stopped. And I remember it very well. I went to a meeting and said, "Whew, I finished my book." I mean, this is like three and a half years after I started the book. And a woman in our consciousness raising group, that's when she said, "Why don't you be the first feminist not to put your name on a book?" And I thought, this is now a negative place for me here. And it's funny because my father, I told, "Hey, Dad," I turned in my book on rape. My mother had died by then. And he said, but it came out of his feeling of failure in life. He said, "So they bought your book. That doesn't mean they're going to publish it."
So you had a lot of support in.
Well, I had a lot of support because rape was happening. It wasn't me. There were now, at that time, rape crisis centers pretty much around the country by women who eventually burned out. But there was a whole network of rape crisis centers that had sprung up.
And we had, New York Radical Feminists had gone to Lindsay and asked him to declare, Mayor Lindsay, August rape awareness, and he broke out in laughter. He broke out in laughter. He thought it was so stupid.
Yeah.
And his aides were very embarrassed about his reaction. But there was a rape awareness month as a result of that meeting, and that's when I met the New York Radical, the Women's Political Caucus, who were active in changing the laws, and they got the laws changed in New York State.
the corroboration laws.
The corroboration laws that made it impossible
right,
to
of course, it was
prosecute.
ridiculous
Yeah.
that the rapes are not usually committed at high noon,
Right.
in front of lots of other people.
Right, and so, and then after the publication of the book, I mean, you did have an excellent review of the book, right?
Oh, yeah. In
The New York
New York
Times.
Times book review. It was on the front page, and it went on for pages. It was remarkable.
And it was a bestseller,
It was.
and now it's been translated into I don't know how many languages all over the world.
I'm getting, for the first time, a South Korean translation. Yeah, they sent me some money. Yeah, South Korean.
And if you
That's
open
nice.
the book, every single issue is still under discussion.
Yeah,
Unfortunately,
unfortunately, we've lost tremendous ground on rape, and we've lost tremendous ground on abortion.
right, right.
Yep, and of course, a lot of it is Mr. Trump, our unstable genius. Yes.
Well, since he dominates all discussions, we will not talk about him. But after the rape conference and after the book, you then became a leader of the anti-pornography movement
Yep.
in New York City,
Yep.
which was as difficult as the rape issue. Tell me how you got involved in the anti-pornography movement, which was so pivotal.
It started in California, as many of our issues did start. You know, we have a big country, and actually Detroit was a big center too. There was a group in California called WavePam, Women Against Violence in Pornography and Media. I think that's what it was called, WavePam. They had a conference out in San Francisco, and they invited me. They invited Andrea Dworkin. We both went. It was a day-long conference. Then they had a march. And what I remember about the march is that everybody was waving at them, the local San Francisco people, with this smug look of, oh, aren't we wonderful in San Francisco? There's always something interesting in this. Oh, hi gals. Yeah. And I said to the two organizers, they were Laura Lederer and Lynn Campbell, I thought that the future of the movement was in her.
But you got a little office in
She
Times-
did. We
Yeah.
had a meeting here, and we had a guy from the city who came to visit us.
a New York Times, the Times Square,
Mayor's Midtown Enforcement Project.
right,
Yeah.
right, and
Right.
they gave a little office.
Well,
right?
the guy came here and said, well, what do you need? And Lynn Campbell piped up, office space. And there was a bar in the Times Square area on, I think it was on 9th Avenue or 8th Avenue. And the city foreclosed because they were so far behind in their taxes. And he said, I think we have a space for you. You know? And then we got in touch with the New York League of Theater Owners, and they saw our mission as a Clean Up Times Square mission, which at the time we were just so offended. I mean, this was a national movement. It's not just clean up Times Square. But I'll tell you, the work that we did do, which did help clean up Times Square, was terrific.
And you had tours.
Oh, we sure did. I'm trying to think if that was a Lynn idea too, Lynn Campbell idea. But we announced that we were having, we would take people on tours of Times Square.
All the peep shows, right?
All the peep shows, yeah. And it was so popular that in Europe it became a tourist attraction. People were telling people, it got into their newspapers, if you go to New York, there's something that's absolutely free that knock your socks off. Yeah, those tours. Yeah, we had a slideshow. We had the famous picture from Hustler of a woman's body being put in a meat grinder and her legs were up in the air. People would say that. We showed pornography of Nazis and, assaulting women, and we had Jewish war veterans come. They were apoplectic. Where did you find that? I said, in Times Square.
Now, I went to a conference in Barnard. I'd been assigned to go to this conference in Barnard by Planned Parenthood, and it so happened to be the same day as my sister's wedding. So I was furious, but there was no way of getting out of this, attending this conference. And lo and behold, at the end of this conference, you and others of the anti-pornography movement showed up to protest this conference, because this conference, unbeknownst to Planned Parenthood or me or whatever, was saying S&M as so the wars between the there were several wars. There were the people who were against censorship, and then there was the pro-pornography group that Ellen Willis was very much,
absolutely.
Alex K. Shulman, who wanted to define the anti-pornography movement not as a feminist critique and explosion, but to sort of say you were anti-sexuality. So it was really fierce fighting.
It was
within the women's movement.
It was a very damaging slogan. They called themselves the pro-sex feminists, and the implication was that we were the anti-sex feminists. Yeah. And then they had this group called FACT, Feminist. It's an acronym. A Feminist Anti Censorship Task Force. Yeah, there must have been 6 of them, but they created a lot of trouble. And on the West Coast, there was a woman named Pat Califia who was their person defending sadomasochistic practices as part of women's natural sexuality. And she was, it was tops and bottoms, and she was a top. And it's true, unfortunately, most of the women drawn to her were bottoms, and they were masochists. And she rode high for a number of years. And then, you know what? She transgendered and became Patrick Califia. I wish she'd done it a little earlier.
So now there's a movement to legalize prostitution and...
yes, so needless to say, I'm against that.
Right. What issues besides rape were of greatest concern to you? You've mentioned abortion.
Those have been my 2 big issues. And those were the issues that unified women to have a real feminist movement. First, abortion rights. We've lost badly. And then with rape, and all those, we didn't have rape kits when I was writing against our will, but, the rape kits were supposed to be
Yes, we did it at the hospitals, but they wouldn't use them. That was the battle then.
Exactly.
They had the rape kits, they wouldn't use them. We got them to use them, and then nobody actually looked at the DNA results.
Yes. And therefore,
for years.
There were serial rapists going from state to state, and they could have been stopped in their tracks.
That's still a problem of unexamined rape kits.
Yes.
And that's still a problem.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's expensive to do the analysis. So
there was a guy just recently in the news. He had been, the FBI used to call them career rapists. Now they're understood as serial rapists. He went from state to state, and mostly he found young prostitutes, young women who were so vulnerable, and they assumed that he was a trick, and then he'd kill them.
Yeah. He killed 93 women so far. That's what he admitted
Yes,
to.
you've read that story.
Yes, I
It's-
did.
It's the most astonishing story. And he has this vivid memory. He does pictures of all of them. He remembers them all. Woo! Yeah.
Yeah. And that would be a tremendous boon if they would analyze the rape kits.
Yep.
And then they don't.
Yep.
And they don't.
They would have had the DNA evidence.
And then after the anti-pornography activism, when did you sort of fade out of that? Because it's still going on.
Well, there's this woman who has, Gail Dines, has made that her life's work. Well, you know, when
They branched out to, anti-trafficking.
Yes.
It's really,
Yes.
Charlotte Bunch.
Yeah.
Leachholtz, Dorchen Leachholtz.
So Dorchen Leachholtz.
We
That's
worked
right.
on the surrogacy issue together, and
Yeah.
she linked surrogacy to
Yeah.
the trafficking of women, which is
Yes.
companies' surrogacy.
Yeah, well, my activist days were behind me by then. You know, I followed it. It was interesting to see it.
Now it says, what were your major accomplishments personally, and that you were involved with?
Well, I have to say that publishing the book on rape was probably my best moment. You know, sometimes I'm just amazed that people still remember my name because the Me Too movement seemed to get by without me. Nobody was saying, did you read Susan Brownmiller's book?
Right, because so many
Yeah.
of the
But
it's
you know,
rape. It's
I think
rape.
it happens to most writers. Like you think you're unassailable in your work. See, that was my feeling. My work is going to talk for me for the rest of my life. I don't have to go out there anymore. But it's not true. People will try to tear you down anyhow, and they do. I was somewhere where a woman came over to me, didn't say who she was, and she said, "What do you think of the people who march?" You know, it was these were people who felt that they could wear whatever they want to, and I said, "Well, you can, but you know there are predators out there, and I would advise you not to wear whatever you think you can wear." And I also would advise you not to go to a fraternity house and get drunk, because even though it's not supposed to affect the outcome of the jurisdiction of the crime, truth is that there are a lot of women haters out there who'll say, "Oh no, this was not a rape. It was obviously consensual."
And we do not live in an ideal world.
Certainly don't.
And pretending that we do is sort of foolhardy.
And with PC language getting to be, what it is, it's like destroying language. I just feel, I have to feel positive. I have to feel we'll win on abortion, and I have to feel we'll stop all this nonsense about it's God's will if you are raped.
How has your involvement in the movement affected your later life, personally and professionally?
Oh, I'm just so glad it happened, that we had a movement. And it was never easy. In our famous West Village 1, Sally Kempton brought in Grace Paley. And she stayed with us for 13 weeks and then said, "Thank you very much. Learned a lot, but I'm going back to my anti-war work." Fair enough for Grace Paley. But we once sort of had a tangle, an ideological tangle, over crazies. I said, I'll never forget, as long as I live, how many people in our movement were crazy. And she said, "Don't attack the crazies. They do a lot. They accomplish a lot." And, I guess she was right.
Yeah, I think in retrospect.
In retrospect, you have to say
you have to say, yes.
that the crazies had their role too, and sometimes they were helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. I was surprised at how many angry women joined now, and then when now attracted less angry women, we did less. It was just bizarre. And I think there was a tremendous brain drain, but this is now, when women could succeed in their professions. Before, you had a sort of
Yes.
underemployed, undercompensated women who had a lot of talent, and they brought that to the women's movement.
Yes.
And that sort of.
But then the big surprise was how many women turned out to be our enemies. You know, I mean, we always said women against, women for, whatever like that, but we never got all of them. There are women to this. I mean, women for Trump. How can there be women for Trump? But there are. There are.
Well, it was just like I'm reading now very boring books about the suffrage campaign in New York State, and then last night I was trying to figure out whether I should bother reading the suffrage campaign in Maine. And again, the shock that there would be women on the other side.
Yeah.
And in the Maine history, you get all the money that went from the liquor interests to the campaign against suffrage, and it was really people forget that the temperance amendment passed before the women's vote. And if that hadn't happened, we wouldn't have gotten the vote. I mean, it was all the liquor interest had already lost, and so
Yeah, well,
you know, it was
Susan B. Anthony started in the temperance movement.
yeah, and anti-slavery movement too,
Yes.
which is something Brent Staples doesn't really seem to recognize.
Oh.
But anyway,
All right.
uh,
Yeah, see, there's still people out there trying to paint our movement as racist.
mhm.
Yeah.
And yet there's so
Birth
much
control.
overlap.
Margaret Sanger was a racist. I mean, they attack everything we've done.
Have you been involved as an activist in the women's movement or other areas since your second wave experience?
There was that first big women's march. I guess it was after the election of Trump, you know, and it was a big thing in Washington, but it was a big thing elsewhere.
In New York.
And I was marching in New York.
Mhm.
And I thought, well, what poster should I carry for this? Made a poster that said, abortion is a good thing. The people I was marching with were not happy with that. You know, I went too far. But it is a good thing, you know. It really is a good thing.
Tremendous amount of freedom.
Yes. You
That
know,
it
if
gives
you
women just
can-
and choice and just.
Yes. We didn't
responsibility.
talk about the gay-straight split.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
right. That was the other issue
That was
during
another-
that time too.
It was a huge
It was a huge issue. It was sort of anti-elitism. They didn't want the famous Susan Brownmiller there, but they didn't want a straight woman either.
Right.
I mean, I'm not talking, but anyway.
No, it's okay.
It was
You're-
a hostile environment.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I remember I once said I didn't come in because they would have women's dances after some action that we had. And I said, I didn't come into this movement to dance. You know, it's just true. I didn't, you know, but people thought, oh, that's just a hostile thing to say. And then they made up this fake quote from Emma Goldman, if it you know, it's not my revolution if I can't dance to it. She never said that.
She never said that. She
No.
wasn't
No.
that sort of person anyway.
No.
Anyway, are you currently involved as an activist?
Well, you know, I'm 84, and that puts a blight on my activism right then, you know, right there. I've not been asked to speak at any current events, you know, on the stage. Someone just asked me to go to Binghamton, and then she said, could you tell us your fees? And I'm thinking, oh, Binghamton. She said, I know you went to Cornell, Binghamton's nearby. I said, I know that too, but I'm 84 and I just had this terrible fall. I can't go to Binghamton.
But I mean, let me tell you, the college fees.
Well,
they
I did.
collect money
I
for
did.
speakers, and it can be up to $2,000 to $3,000. You know.
did before I had this terrible accident.
right.
I spoke at 3 colleges and made very good money. But I have to say that at each college I ran into people who said, "You're all wrong. That's not what we think. We think sex work is a good thing." I mean, what? That was one of their issues. And then at another college, they said, "Well, our issues are transgender rights these days." I said, "Well, that's an issue." You know, these were the women's studies people who took exception to what I said. Well, that's just how it is. I don't like being repudiated like that. One college in New York, and I got 2,500. But I was going along very nicely in the speech, you know, making fun of Harvey Weinstein. That was fine. And then I mentioned, and then I said, and Bill Cosby. Now this was a school with a lot of blacks. And the dean was on the stage, and he came right over to me and said, "Wrap it up." He didn't want to hear anybody attacking Bill Cosby. I was stunned. And I said, "Well, I'm almost finished." He said, "Stop now." I said, "Just have a few more words. Stop now." Well, that was unpleasant. You know, I just hope that I have enough money to last for the rest of my life, you know. But it's not going to be giving speeches around the country. I want to be respected.
Right, right. And not attacked.
Yeah, not attacked.
Right. Well, we live in strange times where there's 1,000 opinions on everything. It's almost confusing, I think, for a young person, given the plethora of different theories and ideological points of view. But you're now a supporter of Elizabeth Warren.
Yes.
Which is very rare. So we rarely agree on candidates to support, but I'm so glad to be alive to see her candidacy, and I hope she wins, but who knows.
I wish her the best of luck. And
now, is there anything relevant that we haven't covered?
No.
Good.
No, but it's nice that we agree on Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah, it's so
and
rare.
yes, she's likable. And
yeah.
he's nervous, Trump.
So I really want to thank you for your time. And,
it was my pleasure.